to have Seth Yalcin at the PhilMath EXPRESS Seminar. Seth is known for his work, among other things, on epistemic models, expressivism, dynamic semantics, and the methodology of formal semantics. And today is going to talk about Iffy Knowledge. The virtual floor is yours, Seth.
Okay, thanks so much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about a few problems about how indicative conditionals act under nose, and I'll kind of sketch a path forward. I'm not going to do two things. I'm not going to give a formal semantics. I'm more interested today just in getting clear on what the problem is and like what we want a semantics to do. So, and also I think the problem stuff will take so long that, you know, it's always annoying in the last 10 minutes to like rush through some complicated semantics. So I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to just talk more about what we expect the semantics to do. And I think we'll probably maybe not agree about that anyway. And I'm also only going to like cut through maybe one path forward. I think I'm not going to try to prove that it's the only path. So, you know, you might listen and think you see just a different kind of approach to the problem. And so I'm eager to hear what you think about that. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I have a little handout. Let me share it in the text thread again, just in case people didn't get the link. If you want to follow along on your own and have the PDF, there it is. But I'm going to share my screen with the PDF anyway. Okay. All right. So yeah, so let me just start with a couple examples. Okay, so here's a case to think about. So I have two favorite cafes. They're across the street from each other. I want to take you to one of them, but I don't care which. So I pick one at random and we go. Sitting in the cafe, I can say the counterfactual. If we weren't at this cafe, we'd be at the one across the street. It's weird to say the indicative. If we are not in this cafe, we're at the one across the street. That's just kind of a classic minimal pair demonstrating the difference between counterfactuals and indicatives or epistemic conditionals, which is really what I'm talking about today. Now, Bill glances, suppose our friend Bill is going to meet us, and he glances into the cafe we're in fact in, but he doesn't see us. So he goes looking for us at the cafe across the street. I could explain as follows. I told him we'd be in this cafe or that one, so Bill knows we're either at this cafe or at the one across the street. So there I'm ascribing to Bill knowledge of a disjunction. But I think I also could have said, Bill knows that if we're not at this cafe, we're at the one across the street. You know, I'll just mention here, when I first started thinking about this years ago, I think my theoretical background just convinced me that for couldn't be okay to say, because, you know, if you've been thinking about factivity and conditionals long enough, you just know you think you know certain kind of things about what ordinary speakers are supposed to say, all right? Because you're thinking about some of these properties I'm about to talk about. But so if you're like that, if your initial reaction before is like, no, I don't think that's okay to say, I don't think people would accept that. I can just tell you that I've talked to a lot of ordinary speakers of English that do not flinch for a second at for. They're totally comfortable with it. Even when you try to cajole them in different ways. So I think for's an okay thing to say about Bill, and is probably a true thing to say about Bill. So anyway, but it's felicitous, and so that's surprising. And now, you know, if you were just an ordinary speaker and you found for totally fine, you're like, well, what's the big deal? Why who cares? Here's why it's kind of puzzling. So first, there doesn't, on the face of it, it looks like if 4 is okay and true, then, well, shouldn't 4 entail 2? And, but we just said 2 doesn't sound okay. It doesn't sound true anyway to say if we are not in this cafe, we're at the one across the street. Like, imagine being in a cafe saying that to the person across from you. That's just a bizarre thing to say. It's quite odd to think 4 is true and therefore entails 2, and so 2 is true. So it looks like there's a failure of entailment, or there's some kind of entailment problem here. It doesn't look like there's an entailment from 4 to 2. At any rate, different, like more conversational or presuppositional conception of entailment, or like a context-based notion of entailment or acceptance, right? That doesn't seem right. You can certainly accept 4 in a conversation without accepting 2. So what's that about? It doesn't look like 4 places any rational pressure on you to accept 2. But that's kind of weird. That's generally not the case with knowledge descriptions. If I just said, Bill knows that it's raining, that would entail that it's raining, and it's hard to accept Bill knows that it's raining without accepting that it's raining, right? So why should the conditional be any different, right? So that's the first problem. Second problem is a problem about factivity. On the face of it, 4 doesn't seem to presuppose the conditional that it embeds. So closely related problem, I guess. Again, we're in a context where it would be infelicitous to assert the indicative conditional. So there's neither an entailment nor a presupposition of the conditional embedded under the knowledge operator seems present here. So yeah, I'm using factivity in the more presuppositional sense. Sometimes philosophers use it to pick out a category of attitudes, of which knows is one. But knows is classically thought to be an example of a presuppositional verb. So what's going on there? Why doesn't it presuppose the conditional it embeds? And then finally, there's a kind of third problem, which I think isn't quite as pressing as these first two, but is at any rate like a residual, leads to some puzzlement. And this is about presupposition projection. So since, for instance, Stallnacher's paper on indicative conditionals in 1975, many people have thought, this isn't exactly what Stallnacher himself said, but many have thought that indicative conditionals presuppose that their antecedents are epistemically possible, meaning they might be the case, right? That would explain what's wrong with 2, right? Like, it's weird to say, if we're not at this cafe, we're at the one across the street, because that sounds like you're leaving open that we might not be in this cafe, but we are in this cafe. So you're saying something that kind of requires it to be open, that you might not be here, and that's why it sounds bad. So that's a natural idea that somehow you need to write it in, that epistemic conditionals, let's call it the openness presupposition, that they presuppose that it might be that the antecedent is the case. So if that is right, which, again, that hypothesis would explain what's wrong with 2, very, very elementary data, that 2 is wrong. If indicative conditionals have that presupposition, then the further puzzle is, why doesn't the presupposition get inherited by the whole ascription 4, right? Knows is usually thought to be a whole in Cartesian sense. So like it lets through. I mean, it's complicated. There are subtle other kinds of cases, but in a case like this, you might have thought, well, knows would just pass through the presuppositions of the stuff it embeds and just let the whole knowledge ascription inherit that presupposition. So if that was right, and if the indicative conditional presupposed the openness of the antecedent, then 4 ought to presuppose that it might be that we're not in this cafe. And therefore, 4 should be marked. It should be as marked as 2. But evidently, 4 doesn't inherit this presupposition. So those are some problems, and I'm going to try to think through the best thing to say about this problem. So let me quickly mention one idea that I want to suggest isn't going to work, which you might think goes like this. Maybe subjects are just sort of charitably reinterpreting this knowledge description so as to ascribe something counterfactual. Maybe you're just kind of politely reinterpreting for Bill knows that if we're not at this cafe, we're the one across the street, to say Bill knows that if we weren't at this cafe, we'd be at the one across the street. I mean, when you kind of think about it, it's not immediately obvious how these differ anyway and what they're saying. You might have thought, I don't know, speakers are just adjusting mood on the fly to just make the most sense of what you're doing, and so it's not it's just a kind of like, this is sort of like, strictly speaking, not the right thing to say, but there's a nearby thing you could say that would be okay, and so, you know, speakers gravitate to that. So kind of error theory. Of course, I'm not sure if this error theory, like the logic of it makes any sense, because why wouldn't this error theory just work for two? If you can just adjust mood on the fly or something and like reinterpret stuff to make sense of what the speaker's saying, well, why don't you just do that for the unembedded conditional? So you have to be careful with these like error theories that just make up a story because they overgenerate usually, and that's what's happening here. So I don't think that idea works. But anyway, just to kind of confirm that it doesn't work, we could just consider a second case. We should consider a second case anyway, just to keep the intuitions, make sure they're not sensitive to random features of the example. So if we consider another case, we can rig that case so that the relevant counterfactual is not even true anyway. So here's a case like that, and this came up with in conversation with Kai von Fintel. Did somebody have a clarification? Okay, I wasn't sure. Somebody was about to clear their throat there. Okay, here's the second case to think about, kind of much to the same point, right? So in here, imagine we have 3 cups and there's a marble under one of them. It ends up under cup A. We make Jane guess where it is, telling her just that it's under one of the cups. She guesses C. We say, nope, it's not under C, it's under A or B. Guess again. Before she guesses, before we show her, I think we can say Jane knows it's under either A or B. I can also say Jane knows that if it's not under A, it's under B. Again, we know that it's under A. My experience, ordinary speakers judge these to be equally acceptable. So just another example of the same phenomenon, because well, you know, the basic structure of these cases are, in the matrix context, we know the antecedent of the indicative is false. Nevertheless, we're ascribing knowledge, we're truly ascribing knowledge to somebody using an embedded indicative with that antecedent that we know is false. So that's just another case like this. But the relevant additional feature here is that the counterfactual, if the marble weren't under A, it would be under B, is not true, assuming we allocated the marble in a random way, which was what was stipulated. So there's just another case to think about. And of course, you know, you might have been thinking, well, this is all kind of reminding me of Sly Pete, the Gibbard example, the riverboat case, for those of you familiar with the conditionals literature. And indeed, you can turn all of this into something like a Gibbard style case. If you don't know the Gibbard cases, you know, don't worry about it. I'm not going to presuppose familiarity with it, but this kind of example will be reminiscent of that. So suppose we have another person. I'm going to close epistemic Sly Pete case. So we have Jane, and now let Carl play the game too in isolation from Jane. The cup's still under, the marble is still under A. We make Carl guess where it is. He picks B, and we say, nope, it's not under B, it's under A or C, guess again. And again, it's just symmetric with the Jane case. People will say, Carl knows that if it's not under A, it's under C. And to my real surprise, people seem totally fine with a sentence like 10. Jane knows that if it's not under A, it's under B, and Carl knows that if it's not under A, it's under C. Of course, especially if you've grown up on an unbalanced diet of purely propositional conceptions of indicative conditionals, then that will look really puzzling to you, because it looks like it's saying that one agent knows a proposition, a conditional proposition, whose truth is just incompatible with proposition the second agent knows. That's why I think some philosophers like Stallnacher, who in his book Context discusses sort of a similar case. He doesn't talk directly about a conjunction like 10, but I think he notes in the text the possibility of that, and describes that as kind of a paradoxical ascription. But yeah, again, it looks like people are okay with saying these things, and this is also something noted in a forthcoming paper by Caleb Hurl. Yeah, so this is a bit. These marble cases make for very easy to understand versions of Gibbard-like phenomena. So good. So there's a basic sense of the kind of problem I want to understand. Like, what is going on here? What are we ascribing when we ascribe this Iffy knowledge? I think on the face of it, it's pretty hard to see how to square these data with a propositional understanding of indicative conditionals, that is, some view according to which they express some like possible worlds proposition. I think if you're going to have a view like that, you're going to need a lot of context sensitivity at various crucial moments, doing just the right thing. And well, like I said, I'm not going to like try to knock down competitor views. I would think of that as like a competitor view to the kind of approach I want to suggest. So I'm not going to try to present some knockdown argument against this, some more contextualist, traditional kind of, maybe something like Stallnacher would embrace. But just to kind of put it out there, my general worry would be about actually articulating the context sensitivity in any kind of systematic way that will get the judgments that we need in these cases without over-generating. I seriously doubt that that's going to happen. But we could talk about it if folks have ideas there. But all right, so let me sketch, like, not a semantics, but a kind of flat-footed truth condition for an Iffy knowledge description as a starting point towards what, before you design a semantics, right, you need to like have some sense of what the sentence is doing before you can assign roles to the parts of the sentence to get that result. So like, what's the result we want? So like, let's pick one of these descriptions like 9. Carl knows that if it's not under A, it's under C. What do we want the semantics to deliver? Here's a flat-footed thought, which I kind of think of as going back to Ramsey, Frank Ramsey, that famous like brief passage in his paper on causality. So the idea would be 9 is true just in case, and here kind of embrace like a broadly possible worlds conception of knowledge states and attitude states generally. Suppose we did that, then we could try saying 9 is true just in case there are worlds where the marble is not under A among Carl's epistemic alternatives. So his epistemic alternatives don't rule out the possibility that it's not under A. And all of those worlds are where it is. And all of these are worlds where it is under C. Okay. So I guess it's kind of like saying Carl has only epistemic alternatives open where it's either under A or under C, and he at least has some possibilities where it's not under A. So there's a very simple idea about, and why is this like the Ramseyan idea? Well, it's kind of like that's a state where if you take Carl's epistemic state, you temporarily add to it the information that it's not under A, and then you ask, does the resulting state of information entail that it's under C? If so, then 9 is true. That's like a very simple idea. That's not, of course, again, not a semantics. It's just an intuitive idea for what the semantics might want to vindicate. One of the crucial things to notice, though, about this idea is that this, you're making use basically of like a local context, Carl's epistemic state as temporarily updated by the antecedent. And the thing to notice is that that derivative state is not necessarily at all itself a knowledge state. Why isn't it a knowledge state? Well, given that the marble is under A, then if you take Carl's epistemic state and update it with the proposition that it's not under A, the result excludes the actual world. So of course it's not a knowledge state, but it's a state you get as a function of an epistemic state. But I think this fact that it's not a knowledge state is important. Ultimately, this is why in my abstract I said something about, well, maybe Iffy knowledge is not really knowledge. And what I mean in saying that is, like, you're ascribing something to Carl, but ultimately you're talking about a state of Carl that is derived from his epistemic state, but it's an Iffy knowledge state. And so that is to say, an epistemic state that is the result of a temporary update with an indicative or epistemic conditional antecedent. And that kind of state isn't itself necessarily an epistemic state at all. So Iffy knowledge in that sense, if we mean by Iffy knowledge, we mean these kinds of derived states. Iffy knowledge states are not knowledge states, not generally knowledge states. Okay, so yeah, so this kind of general line of thinking is what I want to consider. So suppose we pair that picture of Iffy knowledge with a matching picture of what it is to accept an indicative conditional conversation. You might have an acceptance condition like this. Indicative conditional is accepted or presupposed relative to the context set in a conversation, just in case there are open antecedent worlds in the context set. And all of those worlds are worlds where the consequent is true. So that's like a conception of what it would take for an indicative conditional to be common ground in a conversation. And this is a truth condition for Iffy knowledge description. Again, neither of those necessarily gives you the semantics yet, but it places some non-trivial constraints on what the semantics is going to do. And they both, you might think of them as both building in this antecedent openness presupposition I mentioned at the beginning. All right. So if you just say that, I think you already make some progress towards resolving the problem. So we observed this entailment problem, the failure of entailment from 4 to 2. And similarly, things like 10 to 11. It would be weird to conclude from 10 that if it's not under A, it's under B, and if it's not under A, it's under C. Like, that's just a weird thing to say. Of course, like, there's much more technical contexts of reasoning or reasoning for reductio where we do talk like that. But I take it that in natural language semantics, we're not like principally guided by these intuitions that really come from some kind of proof theoretic training. So I'm not really taking that kind of reasoning all that seriously. I think 11 sounds weird as a basic data point. So we want a story that explains why. Okay, so we could say that we reject 2 because we reject its antecedent openness presupposition. But given a Ramsey-style truth condition for Iffy knowledge descriptions like 4, our rejection of 2 is compatible with our accepting 4. There isn't really, the point here is that you can be in a context, you can have the truth condition I've sketched for 4, but not necessarily, and even accept it in context and not be in a context that has to accept 2, given this kind of truth condition. So something similar goes for 10 and 11. Given that B and C are incompatible, there's no context set that accepts 11. But if you have the conditionals embedded under distinct knowledge operators, you're just describing 2 states of Iffy knowledge, and those might both obtain, given this kind of picture of what Iffy knowledge is. So yeah, if there's a key thing here, it looks like you just need this notion of a local context. The truth of these ascriptions turns on what propositions are accepted, not really by an epistemic state or states, but by certain non-epistemic states, the ones you get from updating epistemic states with false antecedents. So maybe that's a little bit stronger than I mean to say. Of course, it does matter what you know. That is an ingredient in the truth condition of a Iffy knowledge description. But the point is, again, you're using the epistemic state and constructing a derived state from that. You're considering a kind of local update of that state, and that's what really matters. Okay. Okay. Yeah, and for all this says, everything we usually say about knowledge of non-conditionals can just be left in place. So you still have entailment and presupposition and so on when you're talking about non-Iffy knowledge, just ordinary propositional knowledge ascriptions like Jane knows it's raining or whatever it is. There you still have entailment and so on. Okay. Right. So yeah, I mean, basically I'm denying that 4 does after all entail 2, and that 10 does after all entail 11. Okay. Which is kind of interesting, you know, there's true knowledge. If that's right, then there are true knowledge descriptions that simply don't entail their prejacents or the embedded clauses. Okay, how about the factivity problem? We evidently have, again, this pattern where presupposition fails. So here I think there's something kind of interesting to observe. I'm not sure what to think here exactly, but so I'm really curious if there's somebody here that can help me think about this. So so again, the worry was, take 13, just an ordinary factual knowledge claim. Jane knows that it's under A. The standard textbook view is that presupposes that it's under A. The usual diagnostics, negation, and blah, blah, blah. And then what I'm observing is Jane knows that if it's not under A, it's under B, does not presuppose that if it's not under A, it's under B. By that, I chiefly have in mind this point that you can be in a context that accepts the knowledge description, but that does not count as accepting the indicative conditional, the epistemic conditional. So what account of presuppositional of the presuppositional dimension of knows predicts this pattern? It doesn't look like the kind of classic idea of presupposition in terms of definedness or failures of definedness is going to help here. So what's that idea? Without trying to give some kind of comprehensive background on presupposition, but here's just like a crude version of the idea. It's the idea that A knows that phi is undefined where phi is false, right? So that's one version of the explaining presupposition failures as failures of definedness in the semantics. Another kind of version of that idea is that A knows that phi imposes a definedness condition on its local context, this more dynamic semantics idea. So that when you're evaluating the knowledge description, you got to do it relative to an information state that already accepts the prejacent. So, those ideas work, I think, for the basic case of 13, just the ordinary factual knowledge claim. But they don't work for 7, the Iffy knowledge description. This is just the data. It just seems to show that this doesn't get the right result in those cases. So that seems like a problem, though, for the idea that the presuppositional dimension of knows is semantic. Like, if you thought you could just, okay, like, when you ask, okay, knows is presuppositional, what does that mean? And you answered, well, it means that when you write in the lexical entry for knows that, it's undefined, the description is undefined, where the embedded clause is false, that's option 1. Or option 2, the context change potential of the description is undefined if the input context doesn't already accept the prejacent, right? There's another kind of definedness idea. Like, if you just thought you could characterize the presuppositional dimension of knows by like writing that into the lexicon, well, that just gets the wrong result in these examples. So either there's some other way of semantically encoding the presuppositional dimension of knows that isn't one of those that gets these data, which if there is one, I don't know what it is. If maybe somebody here does, and I don't, nothing comes to mind here. Either that, or actually the presuppositional dimension of knows is pragmatic, meaning that it owes more to the sort of state the predicate describes than to some conventional stipulated feature of the semantics of the verb. So that kind of view, the closest thing to that I've seen in the literature is the sort of view of knows that is described by Stallmacher in, I think Pragmatic Presuppositions. He has this kind of paragraph or two where he tries to kind of figure out a sense in which knows is presuppositional without making it a semantic presupposition. So to be honest, I never found that approach all that attractive until I started to think about these data and about what a semantic approach to presupposition could say. And so I do think like another benefit of thinking about these data is maybe the light it throws on what it even is to be a presuppositional verb, and whether that, whether to put that in the semantics or the pragmatics. Maybe there is some pressure here to put the presuppositional dimension of knows in the pragmatics. Okay, so that's a little bit about presupposition, and then circling back to this projection problem, the third problem that I mentioned at the beginning. So again, that problem was it looks like we have this pattern, the unembedded epistemic conditional. If it's not under A, it's under B, presupposes that it might not be under A, presupposes the antecedent's open. Whereas the knowledge description that embeds 14 doesn't inherit that presupposition. Whereas we usually expect knowledge descriptions to inherit those presuppositions. So why doesn't this presupposition project? Here, I think it's kind of like easy to see what the dynamic or local context-based view would be able to say. Here, you can think of the presupposition as imponent. If you wanted, you could just try this very flat-footed idea of, well, formalize this openness presupposition in the traditional dynamic U way. If phi, then psi imposes a definedness condition on its local context. So, you better make sure that it's updating an information state that leaves the antecedent open. And with a construction like 7, this requirement that the indicative conditional comes with doesn't manifest as an constraint on the matrix context because the conditional is embedded. It's under a knowledge description. So it places that requirement on the knowledge state. So it shakes out as the requirement that Jane's knowledge state must satisfy rather than the matrix context. So on the face of it, that seems like it should be enough to solve the problem. And explain why the presupposition that we might want to attach to the epistemic conditional, this openness presupposition fails. Alas, there's still some problems in that vicinity, so I'll mention some of them and then stop talking. So I kind of, I feel like something like this ought to be close to true, but there are some problems that stand in the way. So, and I guess I'll talk about what I have in mind mainly when I get to section 4.2 here. But let me just flag some other things that we need to think about, like on the way towards a semantics. So consider Jane's case again, and here I want to think about the connection between knowledge and beliefs. So suppose she guesses C, and we lift the cup and she sees no marble. And now imagine she guesses B. We lift the cup for B. There's no marble there because it's under A. But, suppose there's some trick of light or something's in Jane's eye, whatever. Jane mistakenly thinks that she sees the marble under B. And so she's wrongly certain that the marble is under B. And so she's certain that it's not under A. 15 is true, but by stipulation. Can this be true together with Jane knows that if it's not under C, it's under A? That would be weird. It would be weird to think you can say both of those things. So the basic point is, it looks like we need to ensure that there are the right connections between the knowledge state and the belief state when it comes to indicative conditionals. If we're just talking about the epistemic state and what things it leaves open and whether certain possibilities are live, and if you update it with this, you get that. Jane's knowledge state might be such that let me see here. Oh yeah, maybe I have a slight typo in this example. Let me just make sure sorry. Let me just make sure I wrote this the right way. Yeah. Sorry, I think I might have meant to write B here, but I'm in the moment I'm going to get myself confused if I think too much about it. So, but there's this broader point that maybe I can make with a different example better. But the larger upshot is just that I've been saying we need to think about epistemic states as updated temporarily with false antecedents and think about those as figuring the true conditions of the knowledge descriptions. But we also need to make sure at the same time that there isn't this sort of radical disconnect between what the agent can be said to believe or be certain of. So you want to make sure that, like, an agent's, owing to their epistemic state, it might be the case that they accept certain indicative conditionals or they know them, but if the truth of a knowledge description, of an Iffy knowledge description, is only a matter of what is accepted after we update the knowledge state with the antecedent, there is the potential for Iffy knowledge descriptions to come radically apart from Iffy belief descriptions. And we don't want that, since those kinds of descriptions will sound really weird if you can join them. Like, you don't want to say that agents know conditionals that they don't believe. Right. So we might need to, it would be sad if we had to just hardwire that into the semantics. It would be nice to derive that fact from some more general models of knowledge and belief. I don't immediately see how to do that yet, but that's anyway a connection we need to make sure makes sense. This is just another thing I think we need to think more about, and a semantics needs to clarify. Okay, and then finally, there's this other problem about what you might call mighty knowledge. Suppose Jane gets to look under C and sees that the marble isn't there. She leaves the room. We've been saying that these are compatible. The marble's under A, and Jane knows that if it's not under A, it's under B. Now, given the way that I've been talking about this antecedent openness presupposition, the picture that I've sketched suggests that when you say 7, Jane knows that if it's not under A, it's under B. That implies that Jane knows that it might not be under A. But and this is a place where the data might be subtle, and it's like perhaps not the best place to constrain a theory with these data, but just to maybe mention it for discussion, it does seem like people find that a lot more odd than 7. Like, if you're in a context where it's accepted that the marble is under A, you put it under A, let's say. It can be weird to describe another agent as knowing that it might not be under A, right? That's something about that's weird. Whereas the conditional, Jane knows that if it's not under A, it's under B. Somehow, people find it more comfortable to say. But of course, that's a problem if the indicative comes with this presupposition that the antecedent might be the case. So you'll end up with an entailment from 7 to 18. So then there's the question, all right, should we try to block that entailment? And if so, how can you block the entailment while still explaining the data way back from the beginning, this elementary fact that this conditional is bad? Remember, the openness presupposition, the most elementary thing we wanted to do with it was explain why it's bad to say 2. Now, if we just jettison this presupposition, then we don't have an explanation for 2. We need some different explanation. But maybe we do want to weaken the antecedent openness presupposition. So I've been treating that presupposition as the presupposition that the antecedent might be the case, which is epistemically might be the case. But maybe there's a weaker sense of open that isn't full-blown might be the case, but is still some kind of openness. And so, of course, a number of authors, notably Ciardelli in a recent paper, and very interesting recent paper, have talked about ways of grading the information that's open in the context set and trying to identify a subclass of possibilities there that count as the open ones, or the ones that when you say it might be the case you're talking about. So this might be more reason to want a gap between what might be the case and the sense of openness that the indicative conditional needs. Like it might be weaker than full-blown epistemic possibility, but still stronger than like, you know, if something's completely ruled out, that's not okay, because we still need to explain examples like 2. But maybe there's some middle place between not totally ruled out, but also not quite a full-blown open possibility. There's some middle space there. Maybe that's what indicative conditionals really are, really need. So that I think, as you can tell, I still have to think through that kind of case, and whether we want to weaken this antecedent openness presupposition. All right, so now at the end of the handout, is there anything I want to say before stopping? Yeah, so I guess just to say something in general, of course, this is all kind of, I think of as largely in the spirit of I guess what you might think of as a non-propositional conception of indicative conditionals, right? The kind of path I've been pointing towards is a broadly dynamic looking story about conditionals. So I think these kinds of data, when we really scrutinize the way that conditionals behave under knowledge operators, seems like more grist for the dynamic mill to me. It does look like, however you want to slice it, you're going to need to talk about the local contexts that you get from updating an epistemic state with an antecedent. That seems like the way to explain what otherwise, from a purely very kind of static propositional point of view, seems extremely puzzling, namely like just straightforward entailments, failures of entailments. If you only think of knowledge as a relation to a proposition, well, the proposition that you're related to is either true or not. So if you're going to have this classic idea that knowledge is factive, and if knowledge is also a relation to a proposition, how could you possibly have failures of entailment? It's hard to wrap your mind around what options there are, but the data seem to suggest there are failures of entailment. So I think all of this becomes less puzzling from a dynamic point of view, but as I think maybe you can see, there are still many puzzles that remain, and hopefully now in the Q&A, people can set me straight. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.